Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening. The first sign was a flash in the sky, a searing, unnatural light that split the atmosphere like a celestial wound. It appeared just after dusk, casting a violet hue over the horizon. For a brief moment, it hung there, pulsating ominously before the skies erupted with streaks of alien ships descending upon Earth. The world's response was slow, too slow. There had been no warning, no message from beyond the stars, no hints of their approach. One moment, the world was its usual self, rife with its own chaos and noise. And the next, it fell under the shadow of the Amazons. They arrived in ships so vast that they blotted out entire sections of the sky, hovering menacingly above the major cities of Earth. Their arrival was methodical, calculated. New York, London, Tokyo, Moscow, all of Earth's global hubs were blanketed in silence as the Amazons made their presence known. Panic spread like wildfire as governments scrambled to make sense of the invasion, activating every defense protocol known to humanity. It was futile. Within hours, the planetary grid went dark. Communication networks were disabled, entire military infrastructures wiped out in mere seconds by technology far beyond anything Earth had ever seen. Drones and fighter jets, tanks and missiles, all rendered useless, disabled mid-flight, mid-activation. It was as if humanity had been frozen in time, stuck in a moment of terrifying helplessness. And then came the first broadcast. Across every screen, every digital billboard, in every home still holding on to some semblance of functioning power, the same image appeared. A figure tall, armored, and undeniably feminine. She was a commander, the voice of the Amazons. Her features were sharp and striking, her skin an iridescent shade of lavender that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of Earth's waning sun. She stood at least 7 feet tall, her presence imposing, her eyes burning with cold authority. "We are the Amazons," her voice echoed through every corner of the globe, as if it were whispered directly into the ears of every human being. "This planet is ours now." Her words came without explanation, without mercy. There were no negotiations, no demands, just a statement of fact. And as those words rang out, a collective chill ran through the remaining population. Then the executions began. The first to die were the women. It was as if the Amazons had an instinct for it, a surgical precision that targeted the women and girls of Earth. Throughout cities, towns, and villages, human females were pulled from their homes, schools, and workplaces. It was methodical, wholesale slaughter under the watchful eyes of the Amazonian forces. Public squares filled with crowds of onlookers became the settings for execution stages. Blood-soaked platforms raised high so that all could witness the inevitable. Massive drones hovered overhead, capturing and projecting the deaths for the entire planet to see. The displays were cold and unrelenting, women of all ages being shot, dismembered, electrocuted, their bodies discarded like trash in the streets. Entire families were dragged into the streets to watch the females among them executed. The agony in their eyes serving as the final entertainment for the invaders. Fathers watched their daughters die, brothers wept for sisters, husbands begged for their wives. It didn't matter. The Amazons moved with machine-like indifference, their faces devoid of emotion, their goals singular. Soon, the sound of screaming filled the air in every city. The stench of death clung to every breath. The Amazons weren't content with simple deaths. They made sure each execution was a spectacle. Women were crucified, their bodies displayed on massive public pyres. In some places, they were marched naked through the streets before being gunned down in front of entire crowds. Even young girls weren't spared. They, too, were torn from their parents' arms and dispatched without mercy. The sight of their tiny bodies crumpling under alien weapons became a hallmark of the Amazons' cruelty, broadcast on every remaining channel. Their deaths broadcast as nothing more than an afterthought in the grand scheme of conquest. The despair that spread across Earth was palpable. With no means of escape and no one left to fight for, the men were left to watch helplessly as the women they loved were butchered in broad daylight. There was no sanctuary. The Amazons hunted with a terrifying efficiency, rooting out women from underground bunkers, evacuation centers, hospitals, and hiding places where families had desperately tried to shield them. Within days, half of Earth's population was wiped out. The remaining men, all dazed and broken, were left wandering the ruins of their cities, haunted by the sight of burning bodies, empty homes, and streets awash in blood. All attempts at resistance had been crushed. Earth had become a dead world in every sense of the word. But the invasion was far from over. The Amazons had not come simply to kill. They had come to conquer. As the last of the executions were broadcast, the voice of the Amazonian commander once again rang through the hollow silence that had gripped the planet. "Your women are no more. You, men of Earth, will serve a higher purpose. Her words sent waves of dread through the surviving male population. Though many were too numb with grief and shock to fully comprehend what was to come, deep down, they knew that their nightmare was only beginning. The ships, still hovering above Earth's major cities, began deploying ground troops in force. Vast numbers of Amazonian soldiers marched through the streets, clad in sleek armor that shimmered under the dull, fading sunlight. The camps were next. Filtration camps. Humanity's men would soon learn what it meant to be selected, to be separated from one another in brutal acts of judgment. The Amazons were efficient, relentless, and unstoppable. Earth had fallen, and with it, all hope had been extinguished. The world had already plunged into chaos by the time the true horror began. When the women and girls were taken, most had still clung to hope, a desperate, fragile belief that perhaps it was some form of political maneuver, an act of intimidation by these invaders. People reasoned that surely the Amazons wanted something in exchange. But it wasn't negotiations the invaders sought. They weren't interested in holding Earth's women for ransom or bartering for resources. No, the Amazons came with a far simpler plan: to cleanse. In the early hours of what known as the purge, the air was thick with confusion. Across the globe, men were dragged out into the streets, forced to stand and watch as the women they loved were gathered in throngs. Mothers clutching their daughters, wives holding on to husbands for strength, teenage girls standing close to their brothers, all trying to process the surreal horror unfolding around them. Then came the killing. It started with the sound, loud, piercing, and everywhere at once. Weapons unknown to Earth ignited, beams of searing energy, sharp and final. The executions were instantaneous in some places. Women disintegrated on the spot, leaving nothing but shadows where their bodies had been. In others, the deaths were drawn out. The Amazons seemed to take a particular pleasure in making certain regions of Earth suffer more visibly. In Europe and North America, women were marched through the streets as crowds of men were forced to follow behind, powerless, chained by invisible bonds of terror. The deaths were public and deliberately grotesque. In Paris, the women were paraded through the broken remnants of the Champs-Élysées, lined up in front of what was once a bustling, thriving city center. Each was shot, one by one, their bodies crumpling into the streets that had known centuries of human history. The streets ran red, the Eiffel Tower casting long shadows over the scenes of massacre. In New Delhi, it was worse. Women were strapped to pillars erected in the heart of the city. Lashed to these structures, their faces contorted in fear, they were set ablaze by alien fire. The Amazons watched in silence as the men below screamed in horror, their loved ones turning to ash before their eyes. All around the world, this played out again and again as human women were publicly reduced to nothing but death and suffering, leaving behind desolate streets filled only with the wails of the men who had survived them. Fathers, brothers, sons, they all watched helplessly as their sisters, mothers, and daughters were exterminated. The scale was unfathomable. Women of every age, every background, from every corner of the globe were targeted. It wasn't just the young or the old, no one was spared. From the smallest infant cradled in her mother's arms to the elderly woman whose body was too frail to even stand, each one was struck down, their lives erased from existence. Entire cities turned into morgues. Bodies piled up, heaped onto the streets like discarded trash. The smell of burning flesh and the cloying stench of blood filled the air, and for days, there was no respite. People tried to run, tried to hide their daughters and wives in basements, but the Amazons were relentless in their pursuit. They scoured every building, every dark corner, dragging out those who dared resist or flee. There was no escape, and the men were left with nothing. There were no rebellions, no cries for vengeance. Every ounce of spirit had been crushed beneath the weight of grief and horror. The loss was too great, too overwhelming. Entire families were obliterated, entire communities wiped out, with half the population turned to nothing but memories. For those men who remained, there was no solace. They wandered the streets like ghosts, stepping over the charred remains of their loved ones, their eyes hollow, their minds fractured beyond repair. Earth was no longer a planet of the living. The laughter, the warmth, the tenderness of women had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell of a world. The men were now truly alone. And still, the Amazons were not done. As the purge reached its climax, the remaining women were rounded up for the final acts of annihilation. In a grotesque display of power, the Amazons gathered massive crowds of men, forcing them to witness the last of the female population dragged to their deaths. Women were hung, electrocuted, decapitated, each method more brutal than the last. Each death a punctuation mark in a global sentence of eradication. By the time the last woman fell, the world had been forever changed. Earth was now a desolate place, a graveyard of memory. Every man left standing was now broken, left only with the knowledge that half of humanity had been slaughtered, and the rest were next. The purge was complete, but the nightmare had only just begun. The filtration camps, the next phase, awaited the shattered remnants of humanity. Those who had survived would soon realize that their fates were no better than the ones who had died before them. In the aftermath of the purge, Earth became a world of broken men. The air itself seemed to mourn, thick with ash and the acrid scent of death. Cities that had once thrived with the vibrant noise of human life were now silent wastelands, filled only with the occasional shuffling of men too stunned by grief to do more than wander. They moved like ghosts, their eyes vacant, searching the crumbling streets for a life that no longer existed. But the Amazons had no intention of leaving these survivors to their misery. With the women eradicated, the invaders turned their attention to the men who remained. They began rounding them up, funneling them into massive filtration camps, sprawling, gray compounds of metal and concrete that stretched across the horizon. These camps were placed near the ruins of major cities, a grim reminder of the world that had been lost. The men, too shattered to resist, were corralled like cattle, herded into these new prisons by their alien captors. The camps were cold and sterile, devoid of any warmth or humanity. Large fences, reinforced with energy fields, made escape impossible, though none of the men seemed inclined to try. They had lost everything: their families, their homes, their hope. Now they had nothing left but the nightmare of the camps. Here they were separated into different groups, subjected to a brutal selection process designed to sort the useful from the disposable. The Amazons, towering figures in gleaming armor, patrolled the grounds with ruthless efficiency, ensuring there were no disruptions, no hint of defiance. The first stage of the selection was simple and cruel. As the men were processed, they were lined up in massive rows, thousands at a time, and marched past groups of Amazon officers. These officers were armed with handheld devices that scanned each man, measuring physical attributes with cold precision. The weak, the sick, and the elderly were identified immediately, pulled from the lines with little ceremony. Men with even the slightest sign of injury or illness were dragged from the groups, their fates already sealed. Those deemed unfit were taken to what the men had begun to call the pits. At first, no one knew what happened in those deep, dark recesses of the camp. But soon, rumors spread, whispered in terrified voices late at night. The unfit were executed en masse, shot, burned, or simply left to die in heaps, their bodies disposed of without thought. The pits became a symbol of despair, a place where hope and life disappeared forever. For the men who survived the initial selection, the nightmare was far from over. The second stage was designed to test their strength, their endurance, their ability to survive under the most grueling conditions. The Amazons forced them into brutal contests of physicality. Fights that pit man against man in savage battles for survival. Only the strongest, the most physically capable, would be allowed to continue. The weak were swiftly discarded, thrown into the pits like broken toys. The fights were violent and primal, staged in the center of the camp for all to see. The surviving men, filthy and half-starved, were forced to turn on one another. They had no choice. It was either kill or be killed. The Amazons watched from the sidelines, their faces impassive as they observed the carnage. The ground, once hard and cold, was soon stained with the blood of the defeated. The cries of the wounded echoed through the camp, but no mercy was ever given. The only reward for survival was the chance to live another day, to fight again, to suffer further. Among the survivors, a sense of numb resignation began to take hold. They were no longer human in the eyes of their captors, just animals to be tested, tortured, and used. Every day more were dragged to the pits, their lives extinguished without a second thought. The strong were kept alive, but only for a darker purpose, one that the men couldn't yet comprehend. Those who survived the selection process were stripped of whatever dignity they had left. Their bodies, battered and bruised, bore the marks of the relentless trials, but they clung to life, unaware of the even more horrifying fate awaiting them. In the distance, the ships loomed like dark sentinels over the camps, always present, always watching. The Amazons had plans for the men who had proven themselves useful, but none of the survivors could yet imagine the true extent of the horror they would endure. They had no idea that the purpose of the filtration camps was not to break them, but to breed them. The men who had fought to survive would soon learn that their trials were just beginning, that their bodies were now to be used as vessels for the alien offspring of the Amazons, and after that, they would beg for the release of death. The selection was complete. The The survivors, those deemed worthy, had been chosen. Their torment was far from over. The survivors from the filtration camps, those men who had clawed their way through the bloody trials and brutal selection, now found themselves in a new hell. The breeding grounds. After the selections, the men had been herded into another section of the camps, a place sealed off from the rest of the survivors. Their numbers were drastically reduced. Only the strongest, the fittest, had made it through the filtration process, but none of them felt like victors. They were prisoners in their own bodies, their lives bound to a fate they couldn't yet comprehend. Whatever hope they had left after surviving the culling soon died as they were marched deeper into the camp. The breeding grounds were unlike anything they had seen. The structure itself was massive and sterile, composed of cold, smooth walls that seemed to hum with an alien energy. The inside was lined with long rows of sterile chambers, each one cold, empty, and devoid of any semblance of humanity. The air was heavy with the weight of what was to come. These were no barracks or dormitories. They were clinical spaces, designed for a singular purpose. The men were no longer just prisoners or survivors, they were livestock. It wasn't long before they understood their new purpose. The Amazons, who had remained silent and distant until now, began to take a more direct role in their torment. The men, still trying to recover from the brutality of the camps, were stripped of their clothing and forced into the chambers, where they were secured to cold metallic slabs, completely immobilized. The air in the breeding grounds was thick with tension, and as the men struggled, the realization began to settle in. Whatever the Amazons had in store for them was something far worse than the bloodshed of the camps. The Amazons entered the chambers, their expressions as cold and impassive as ever, towering over the restrained men. There was no explanation, no words exchanged. It began with a clinical detachment, as the Amazons initiated the process, forced reproduction. Their methods were as cold and calculated as everything else they had done. The process was invasive, horrifying, and completely unnatural. The Amazons used their advanced technology and biological prowess to implant their seed into the men, forcing them into a pregnancy they could not escape. Earth's natural laws, the idea of male and female reproduction, were irrelevant here. The Amazons had mastered the art of biological dominance, bending the rules of nature to suit their needs. The men were now nothing more than vessels, their bodies twisted into something grotesque, as they were transformed into carriers for the Amazon offspring. The process itself was agonizing, both physically and psychologically. The men screamed as their bodies were forced to accommodate something entirely foreign. Pain lanced through them in waves, their muscles and bones contorting as the alien life took root within them. Their bellies swelled unnaturally, grotesquely, as the pregnancies progressed with horrifying speed. Hours felt like days, and days felt like lifetimes, as the men's bodies warped and grew, stretching beyond what any human male body was designed to endure. There was no relief, no moment of reprieve. The Amazons stood by, monitoring the progress clinically, ensuring that every man was impregnated successfully. The men were left in their chambers to writhe and scream, their bodies turning into grotesque parodies of life, heavy with the burden they had been forced to carry. But it wasn't just the physical torment that broke them. It was the knowledge that they had been reduced to this, breeders, tools to further the invasion of their own planet. Each man knew that inside him grew a child that was not his, an alien daughter destined to carry on the legacy of the Amazons' conquest. They were no longer individuals with autonomy or purpose. They were incubators, their bodies desecrated, their humanity stripped away in the name of the Amazons' war machine. And then came the births. The pregnancies were short, brutal, and unrelenting. The men, already weakened and broken, were subjected to the final agony of childbirth. It wasn't the kind of birth anyone could have imagined. The alien offspring ripped through their bodies with violent force, tearing flesh and bone, leaving the men to bleed out, their broken forms scattered across the cold metal slabs. The Amazons watched as each daughter was born, flawless and perfect in their eyes, raised up from the broken corpses of the men who had carried them. The men, writhing in their death throes, were left with no chance of survival. The births marked the end of their torment, but not the end of their suffering. For those who somehow survived the process, death did not come swiftly. The Amazons had a final cruelty reserved for them. Once a man gave birth, his life became forfeit. He was no longer of use, no longer necessary. The Amazons executed them in the most sadistic manner imaginable, sex unto death. They used the men's bodies, drained of all strength, until their final breaths left them, their lives snuffed out as the ultimate act of domination. The men died in agony, their bodies broken, their spirits already long shattered. And in the breeding grounds the cycle continued. More men were brought in, more pregnancies forced upon them. The daughters of war were born again, and each birth marked the end of another man's life. The breeding grounds were nothing more than a factory of death, where the men of Earth were reduced to nothing but tools for the invaders' unyielding conquest. The Amazons had what they came for. Now, with their new army of daughters, they prepared for the final destruction of Earth. The planet had served its purpose, and soon there would be nothing left but ash and ruins. Earth was a dying planet. Its once thriving cities were now graveyards, littered with the broken remnants of humanity, burned-out shells of skyscrapers, shattered monuments, and streets stained with the blood of its people. The skies were perpetually gray, choked with the ash of the dead and the dust of crumbling civilizations. What little light still broke through was cold and distant, casting long shadows over a world that no longer felt alive. The Amazons had done what they came to do. From the moment they arrived, their mission had been clear. The purge had wiped out half of humanity, the women, the girls, the caretakers of Earth's future. The filtration camps had torn the spirit from the men who remained, forcing them to fight for survival, only to face an even more terrible fate in the breeding grounds. Now their purpose complete, the Amazons prepared to finish what they started, the utter annihilation of the planet. They had no use for Earth anymore. Its resources were depleted, its people destroyed, and its cities reduced to rubble. What little remained was insignificant in the face of their grand design. The daughters born from the broken bodies of Earth's men, the perfect warriors bred for conquest, were now the future of the Amazons' empire. Earth had served as nothing more than a breeding ground, a momentary stop on the Amazons' endless campaign of galactic domination. The final blow came swiftly. There was no spectacle, no grand declaration of victory. The Amazons, methodical and efficient, deployed their weapons from orbit. Massive warships hovered silently above the planet, casting their long shadows over the desolate landscape below. From their bellies, they released payloads of nuclear explosives, sending them plummeting toward Earth's surface. The bombs struck in waves, crashing into the heart of every major city still standing. The explosions were cataclysmic, firestorms of unimaginable scale erupting across the planet. New York, London, Beijing, Moscow, all were consumed in the blink of an eye, reduced to molten craters of glass and ash. The skies ignited with the fury of 1,000 suns, and the air itself became toxic, filled with radiation and smoke. The cities that had once defined human civilization were no more, wiped from existence in a series of deafening blasts. The bombs tore through the earth, shattering continents, sinking islands, and boiling oceans. Tsunamis the size of skyscrapers surged across the coastlines, sweeping away what little life remained. Forests turned to kindling in the searing heat, and mountains crumbled to dust as the planet shook under the weight of the destruction. The very ground cracked open, swallowing buildings, people, and history whole. For the few men who still clung to life, hiding in the ruins, the end came like a wave of fire. They had survived the purge, the camps, the breeding grounds, only to be met with the cold, uncaring hand of oblivion. Some tried to run, though there was nowhere left to go. Others simply knelt in the streets, staring up at the burning sky, their minds too shattered to comprehend the finality of it all. They had nothing left, no one left. The world they once knew was gone, and with it, any hope of survival. In the final moments, Earth itself began to unravel. The nuclear blasts had torn deep into the planet's crust, triggering a chain reaction of volcanic eruptions and tectonic shifts. Massive fissures opened up in the earth, swallowing entire cities as magma spewed from the ground, turning the surface into a molten hellscape. The atmosphere, once blue and vibrant, now burned red and black, thick with ash and poison. Above the planet, aboard their massive ships, the Amazons watched impassively. To them, Earth was nothing more than a footnote in their campaign. Its destruction was inevitable, a necessary step in their march across the stars. They had taken what they needed, birthed their daughters, created their next generation of warriors. Now the planet was simply a loose end to be tied up, a useless husk to be discarded. As the final bombs detonated and Earth's surface collapsed into itself, the planet began to die in earnest. The core destabilized, sending shockwaves through the planet's mantle, ripping apart what was left of its structure. In its death throes, Earth's final scream echoed into the void of space, silent and unseen by any who might have mourned it. From orbit, the planet began to implode. Massive chunks of debris broke off, hurtling into the blackness of space as the atmosphere was sucked away. The once blue planet was now a roiling mass of molten rock and fire, consumed by the destruction wrought upon it. The Amazons, satisfied with their work, turned their ships away, leaving the smoldering remains behind. They carried with them the newborn daughters, perfect replicas of their Amazonian mothers, bred for war, for conquest, for the same merciless domination that had brought Earth to its knees. The men who had fathered these daughters, those who had died in agony in the breeding grounds, were nothing more than forgotten echoes now, their lives and legacies erased as thoroughly as the planet beneath them. Earth was gone. The Amazons moved on. The galaxy awaited. There were more planets to conquer, more civilizations to enslave, and the daughters of Earth's destruction would soon grow to become the next wave of warriors, spreading the Amazon Empire across the stars. Earth, once a beacon of human achievement, was now just another casualty in their endless cycle of domination. The galaxy would soon learn what Earth had already known, that the Amazons never stop, and their hunger for conquest is insatiable. The silence of space enveloped the Amazon warships as they drifted away from the charred remains of Earth. Behind them, the planet that had once been the cradle of humanity was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin, a ghostly memory lost in the cold abyss. There were no tears shed, no mourning for the billions who had died. The Amazons had completed their conquest, and now they were moving forward. In the bowels of the ships, the daughters born from Earth's destruction were being nurtured, trained, and indoctrinated into the Amazon way of life. These daughters, flawless replicas of their alien mothers, were the legacy of Earth, though they bore no connection to the men who had suffered to bring them into the world. They had no knowledge of their fathers, no memory of the planet that had been sacrificed for their birth. They were Amazon warriors now, and they were being prepared for one purpose: to conquer. The nursery chambers on the ships were vast, sterile environments where hundreds of newborn daughters lay in incubation pods, their minds already being fed with the knowledge and training they would need. Advanced Amazonian technology accelerated their growth, both physically and mentally, transforming them from infants into fully formed soldiers in mere months. Each daughter was a living weapon, bred for war, her body honed for combat, her mind conditioned for absolute loyalty to the Amazon Empire. The training was brutal, as unforgiving as the Amazonian race itself. From the moment they could walk, the daughters were thrown into battle simulations, taught to wield the deadly weapons of their race with precision and skill. They were taught to suppress emotion, to see themselves not as individuals, but as a collective force of destruction. Weakness was eradicated, ruthlessly weeded out by their Amazonian overseers. Any daughter who showed signs of hesitation or mercy was swiftly eliminated, her existence snuffed out without a second thought. There was no room for anything but strength in the Amazonian hierarchy. Their empire had thrived for millennia by ensuring that only the strongest survived, and the daughters of Earth were no exception. They were the product of Earth's final sacrifice, the last chapter in humanity's long history, and their sole purpose was to continue the Amazon cycle of conquest. As the daughters grew, so too did their lust for battle. It was in their blood, an insatiable drive to dominate, to destroy. They felt no connection to the planet that had birthed them, no sadness for the fathers who had died in agony to bring them into existence. All they knew was the Amazon way, and it was all they needed to know. The fleet moved on through the stars, the daughters of war growing stronger with each passing day. New planets lay ahead, rich with life and resources, waiting to be consumed. The Amazons' next target was already in sight, a distant world teeming with intelligent life, blissfully unaware of the fate that awaited it. The pattern would repeat: invasion, extermination, subjugation. The cycle would continue, as it always had. But these daughters, the ones born from Earth's men, were special. They had inherited the strength of both worlds, Earth's resilient will and the Amazons' cold ruthlessness. And in them, the Amazons saw the future of their empire. These daughters, born in blood and bred for war, would lead the next wave of conquests across the galaxy. They would be the perfect warriors, unmatched in their ferocity, unbreakable in their loyalty to the Amazon Queen. As the fleet approached its next target, the daughters were prepared for their first real test. They would lead the ground assault, their bodies enhanced, their minds sharpened for battle. The planet below had no idea what was coming. Its people lived in peace, unaware that the stars above them held an ancient terror, a force that had destroyed countless civilizations before theirs. The daughters stood in formation, their eyes cold and unfeeling, as the Amazon Queen addressed them from the ship's command center. Her voice echoed through the chambers, hard and commanding. "Your birth was not in vain," she said, her gaze sweeping over the rows of soldiers. "You were born for this moment. You are the future of our empire. You will conquer, you will destroy, and you will bring glory to the Amazons. The weak will fall before you, and their worlds will burn. This is your destiny." The daughters did not speak. They did not need to. Their minds were already aligned with the queen's command, their purpose clear. They would descend upon the new world like a plague, unstoppable and merciless, just as their mothers had done to Earth. They were the daughters of war, and nothing would stand in their way. As the drop pods opened and the daughters prepared to make their descent, the atmosphere in the ship hummed with anticipation. The invasion had begun. One by one, the daughters stepped into the pods, their faces expressionless, their hands gripping their weapons. They were the perfect instruments of destruction, and the galaxy would soon tremble before them. The cycle continued. The Amazons moved on, leaving ruin in their wake, as they had done countless times before. The daughters of Earth, now fully realized as warriors of the Amazon Empire, were ready to take their place in the endless march of conquest. The galaxy had seen many wars, but none like the one that was coming. The daughters of Earth were here, and they would not stop until every planet, every race, every civilization had fallen beneath the shadow of their empire. And as they descended upon the next world, the only sound that echoed through the empty corridors of the ship was the cold, mechanical hiss of the drop pods releasing, sending the daughters of war to their next conquest. The future was theirs, and the cycle of annihilation would never end.